While they distract you with Trump, China has been unifying our enemies, with China convincing yet another giant country to ditch the US dollar. And this is gonna affect everyone. For the past 80 years, America has had the privilege of the dollar being the global reserve currency. For almost 80 years, almost all international trade has been based on the dollar, which has given America an insane amount of power to strong-arm every other country and climb to the top. It allows the US to print as much money as they want, while the rest of the world has to bear the brunt of their inflation. It allows the US to crush whatever country it wants without going to war simply by imposing sanctions on them. Venezuela, Iran, these countries have taken a beating without ever having to launch an expensive invasion. And all of this is only possible because of the dollar. And China hates this. They want out of this dollar-dominated world, and now they've gotten another massive country on their side, Brazil. And this is huge. China has been Brazil's biggest trading partner since 2009. The two countries import and export hundreds of billions of dollars worth of commodities between each other every year, and for decades the dollar was the only way they could trade at all. But just this week, in an announcement no one saw coming, Brazil and China officially agreed to ditch the dollar for good and to start to trade with each other in their own currencies. This move has put Brazil and China's trade beyond the reach of America's grubby little fingers. But it's not just Brazil. China has been successfully getting a slew of other countries to gradually join the anti-dollar, anti-America movements, which means soon we could live in a world where the US is not on top, and the West is pathetically in denial of this. Stay dangerous and let's get into it. And quick side note, we're starting to make a lot more videos to cover stuff like this faster for you guys, which means we're gonna have a lot more sponsor spots available. And I was thinking about it and I thought if we're gonna be promoting more brands, we might as well promote your brands, being that a lot of entrepreneurs watch this channel. So if you run a company or you manage the marketing spend of a company and you want to be featured in one of our sponsor spots, send us an email at business@jaketran.io. That's business@jaketran.io in the description below. Now back to the video. China and Brazil have been buddy-buddies. Back in 2009, China overtook the US as Brazil's top trading partner. Today, Brazil is the largest recipient of Chinese investment in Latin America. And since 2009, China and Brazil's economic ties have only gotten stronger. But there's always been an annoying third wheel, the US dollar. See, no matter how much China and Brazil traded, it all had to be done in dollars, which meant they had to use Western systems like SWIFT that could be cut off. If their currencies were devalued against the dollar, they would be hit with massive price inflation, and in the end, America's economy would always benefit from whatever transactions they made, no matter how badly they wanted to be independent. But now they're not only ditching the dollar, but they're also ditching the SWIFT payment system. A Rio-based Chinese bank will be connected to China's cross-border interbank payment system, or KIPS, an alternative to SWIFT, to support trade settlements between China and Brazil in China's RMB. So now America will have zero control over how the two countries trade with each other. It's the first time in 80 years that two countries this big have openly gone up against America and the dollar. And Brazil knows that by ditching the dollar, they are now making themselves big enemies in the eyes of the US. But they don't care. Probably because they see how distracted America is with all of America's drama and its crumbling economy. And here's the thing, China and Brazil aren't the only ones getting out of the US dollar. But the share of US dollar reserves held by central banks fell by 59%, its lowest level in 25 years, during just the fourth quarter of 2020 alone. And these are the other countries that are jumping on the bandwagon. The most obvious person who wants to move away from the dollar right now is Putin. Russia has been slapped with sanctions after sanctions, so they have had to move away from the dollar fast, and the currency Putin chose is the Chinese yuan. In 2022, trade between China and Russia hit a record $190 billion. That's more than Qatar's entire GDP, or almost as much as Qatar spent on the FIFA World Cup. And most of that has been done in currencies other than the dollar. The dollar's share of Russia's exports has been shrinking, while the Chinese yuan share has been exploding. But not only that, the Chinese yuan has basically become Russia's new reserve currency. Energy exporters are increasingly getting paid in yuan, Russia's sovereign wealth fund. A war chest to support government spending burdened by battlefield costs in Ukraine is using the Chinese currency to store its oil riches. Russian companies have borrowed in yuan, also known as RMB, and even households are stashing savings in it. But that's not where the cooperation ends. China has become a major buyer of Russian oil that is shunned by the West, while Russia has grown more dependent on China for semiconductors and other technology. In recent weeks, the yuan-ruble was often the most traded currency pair on the Moscow exchange based on daily volume. In fact, the yuan is so popular in Russia right now that average everyday Russians are even opening savings accounts in the yuan to keep their money safe from devaluation. And then there's the Middle East. Ah yes, the Middle East. The area of the world that's gotten more than their fair share of good old democracy. I wonder why they would want to move away from the dollar. And China has been instigating it. Iran and Saudi Arabia have always hated each other. The two countries have been on the verge of war with each other for decades. But suddenly, the two decided to settle their differences and re-establish diplomatic relations. This was a huge development. And guess who was there to mediate the deal? China. And definitely not America. But that's not where it ends. Because thanks to their newfound diplomatic relations, two of the Middle East's biggest oil producers are gonna owe China a huge favor. Things like this don't come for free now, do they? Which could be why Saudi Arabia is also considering accepting yuan instead of dollars for the oil it sells to China. If that happens, there's a good chance of it triggering a domino effect where a bunch of other countries all around the world will want to pay for oil in their own currencies too instead of the dollar, which would destroy one of the main things that has been keeping the dollar on the top. The petrodollar, the fact that oil is only sold in dollars, thanks to Saudi Arabia. And now, even India is joining in on the party. India has historically been rivals with China, mostly thanks to the two countries sharing a 2,100-mile-long border that they constantly fight over. The border disputes regularly end up in armed confrontation between Chinese and Indian soldiers, which has made things between the two governments pretty tense. But now even India is following China's lead by announcing its plans to switch all future international trade to rupees instead of dollars. India's new foreign trade policy to be adopted from April 1st will take steps to support international trade using the rupees currency. And India has even agreed to bypass American sanctions by trading directly with Russia using rupees and rubles. India, Iran, Saudi Arabia, all of these volatile countries that can never overcome their differences with each other are now all moving away from the dollar at the same time. And this is no coincidence. No, this is a formalized, coordinated effort to come together to topple the dollar once and for all. This is BRICS, a coalition of countries between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And it was just revealed by a top Russian official that all of this was all according to plan. Quote, the transition to settlements in national currencies is the first step. The next step, this one is important, is to provide the circulation of digital or any other form of a fundamentally new currency in the nearest future. And that first step, the transition to settlements in national currencies, is exactly what we're seeing right now from Russia, Brazil, and India. And step number 2, the creation of a fundamentally new currency is already in the works. The top Russian official also said that the BRICS alliance is working on creating its currency and is scheduled to present ideas on the matter at the organization's forthcoming summit in South Africa in August this year. August 22 to 24. That is the date where the world may never be the same again. That is the day that might officially mark the end of the dollar.
Well, joining us now is Professor John Quelch from the Miami Herbert Business School at the University of Miami. So the BRICS nations aren't a formal trade bloc. So if they do in fact create this new currency, how will it ultimately be used?
So I think what we'd find is that it would initially be used in very large transactions that are government-style transactions between two or more of the countries involved. You know, just to give a little bit of background here, it is the case that the US dollar has a role that is outsized relative to the 24% of world GDP that the US commands. So the US dollar is involved in almost 90% of all international trade settlements, and around about 60% of foreign currency reserves around the world held by central banks are held in US dollars. So the BRICS nations combined their GDP is around about 25% of world GDP, vis-a-vis the US now at 24%. And so it's not surprising that these nations collectively are saying, hey, wait a minute, why should our macroeconomic policies and exchange rates be at the mercy of US dollar Federal Reserve decision making?
But no one in the West wants to believe it. So many reporters and academics out there are saying that this is impossible, that they're never gonna topple the dollar, it's too hard. But they also thought that Rome could never fall, even when it was on the brink of collapsing. They also thought the British pound would never fall, even as Britain was being dethroned as the global superpower. And the same with the Dutch before it. But all of them, every single empire fell, and no one believed it until it happened.
So break down what this would mean. If this currency does come to fruition, how is it going to impact the strength of the US dollar, and what does it mean for the average person out there?
Well, a good analogy, Natasha, would be the euro, which of course has now been around for 3+ decades. And when the euro came in, it was, not regarded as that strong an opponent to the dollar. But the fact is that the European nations have, of course, used the euro to facilitate all of their intra-European trade, and some trade beyond that as well is now carried out in euros. So what I think you would see here, if there is such a BRICS type association, which I think, by the way, would be very difficult to pull off because there is no trade bloc, as you said, that involves these 5 nations. But if there were such a currency, as I said, it would primarily be used initially for intra-trade among the 5 nations, before then being potentially expanded out to other nations. The Chinese have, of course, long aspired to develop a digital yuan as an alternative trading currency. They haven't made a tremendous amount of progress, and so I think this partnership is reflective of that, and the Chinese are trying to use the BRICS association as a way to further push the yuan. Though they're saying it doesn't matter if it's a digital rupee, a digital yuan, a digital ruble, but in actuality, I think we all know that it would likely be a digital yuan, or at least be heavily based on a digital yuan if it were to come into existence.
And if you want to stay on top of what happens at the next BRICS meeting, or if you want to be the first to hear about any new developments in the story, hit that subscribe button. And if you don't know the story already, you can learn exactly how the US dollar came to dominance in the first place in a free video by clicking the square on the screen. They don't teach this stuff anywhere else, and if you enjoyed these videos, you are gonna love this one. Click the square on the screen to watch now.